The cathedrals of downtown are some of the oldest and most distinguished buildings in Tulsa. Many of the church buildings are approaching 100 years of age. All are distinct in their own way. Rhonda Davis is an art historian and adjunct faculty member at Tulsa Community College.
We have a lot of variety in downtown Tulsa, from Gothic inspired to very classically inspired to Art Deco inspired.
One distinct factor of each of the cathedrals is the stained glass windows. Davis says that is a characteristic of church architecture that goes way back.
So people think of that as just being synonymous with Gothic architecture and coming into the churches. It actually goes farther back, to Roman times and even in Romanesque, but very little was used then. And then it starts to come in to play a lot in the Gothic period. So that has a lot to do with imagery for instruction within the church, to instruct, to tell stories.
Though the churches share the characteristic of stained glass, you will soon see that each building has its own distinct architectural style. We'll start with First Baptist Church at 4th and Cincinnati and work our way south.
The church was basically started by a group of pastors who had the vision of creating a downtown church.
The group of pastors that were traveling through the area met with a group of businessmen in downtown Tulsa. They decided that it would be a great place to start a Baptist church.
They first started out the church in a funeral parlor. It was Mowbray's funeral home. And then when they were able to buy land to build, they built one further on down on 4th Street than the present location.
First Presbyterian was the first church in the city of Tulsa. First Baptist was the first of its denomination in downtown.
Well, they ended up on the hill, as a lot of them referred to it as the hill, because it noticeably is up further the road from where they originally built their little white frame church. And they decided that they needed to build something up closer to where all the activity of all the other buildings that were coming in.
With the church growing quite rapidly, the church's main problem was expansion so that they could accommodate all of their members. With a growing congregation, construction and remodeling is a continuing process. The sanctuary has been renovated twice since 1927. The stained glass window from the renovation in 1963 was preserved and is on display in the church's Cincinnati room, previously known as the parlor.
And then later it was decided that they needed to have a larger sanctuary because it couldn't meet the needs. And so the existing sanctuary was built, and the older church was being used as the education building. And then eventually it was taken down, and during Dr. Stohr's time as serving as the pastor here, they built the existing education building, and it was a chapel and all of those buildings through there. As time went on, they decided that they needed something for the youth, and so then they built at the corner on 4th and Detroit our Christian Life Center. They bought up the land there and built the Christian Life Center, and it now is the youth center. And between the Christian Life Center and the AT&T building, or previously known as the Luther Building, was a Solo Glass Company. And when they finally decided that they would sell that property to the church, we demolished it, and then when we went through another renovation again, made the Circle Drive as it is now. And the AT&T building, such a beautiful facade on it, everybody hated to see it to go away. So we had the opportunity to buy.
What makes the architectural style of First Baptist unique is that it still has its traditional roots with modern renovations. It's certainly a joy to watch grow.
They built with the effort of making it blend with the city but yet stand out and be something special. They tried to find the most amiable, comfortable facilities, but yet, as I said a while ago, a sparkling star.
Well, this church got started in precisely November of 1903 when the circuit rider from Veneta, there was apparently an Episcopal church in Veneta, the circuit rider came down to Tulsa and they had a church service in the home of a Mrs. Dan Hunt.
By 1905, Trinity Episcopal Church had enough members to save up and buy a lot downtown. They constructed a house where they held their Sunday services until 1920.
And it was designed by a local architect named George Winkler, who was involved in Holy Family, the Catholic Church, and who also built the school right across the street, which is called Central High School, PSO now. The block we're on was in 6 lots, and it took 100 years for the church to eventually buy up the whole lot. So this is known as Block 146, original town site of Tulsa is the legal description. It was in 6 lots. And we finally purchased the Auto Hotel a couple years ago. You remember the Auto Hotel? Now with the Auto Hotel then, that made it possible to build a really nice parish house, which is where you came in. That is all new, and the parking lot right out in front of it was where the Auto Hotel was, and then the parish house and that is on the property that was between the original church property and the Auto Hotel. It's a beautifully designed building. People come from around to look at it. It's one of the, somebody told me once at one time it was the only Gothic structure west of the Mississippi, I think it was. There aren't too many Gothic churches. Now the Holy Family is too, but you expect that from Catholic churches.
Father Eckel, one of Trinity's longest-serving rectors from 1930 until 1958, had a goal to have more Episcopal churches in Tulsa, since Trinity was the only one at that time. So he started one north, east, west, and south, calling it Boxing the Compass.
St. Luke's Episcopal Church. St. John's is down at 41st and Lewis. That's the biggest of the 4. And then there's one up in the north part of town, and St. Aidan's, and there's one in St. Matthew's is over in Sand Springs. So he managed to start up 4 subsidiaries and start them up so that their finances were solid. They're still with us today.
Another one of the pastors, Father Yonkers, was responsible for the legendary stained glass windows on the 2nd floor of the sanctuary.
He talked enough people into donating enough money to pay for all those windows up there. They just had clear glass in them originally when the church was built.
One of the windows has proven to be quite controversial. It cites the Apostles' Creed. He was crucified, dead, and buried, telling the story of how Jesus descended into hell, only to find a lot of political and religious leaders. People like Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, Benito Mussolini, Buddha, and Muhammad.
So they didn't have enough money for all those windows at the time. It was 35 years before they could afford those windows. It would have been astonishing if they would have came up with any other style of architecture. If you go to New York and look at all the big cathedrals, the Washington National Cathedral is Episcopal, is Gothic. Gothic architecture has just been the church's architecture for, oh gosh, I don't know, the year 1100 or something. It's a long time.
With all the handcrafted wood, the beautiful portraits, and stunning stained glass windows, Trinity Episcopal Church is a landmark cathedral of downtown Tulsa, and definitely a sight to be marveled.
First Presbyterian Church of Tulsa, the city's first church, has changed remarkably since 1885, driven by the power of our vision statement, which is to call and make fully devoted followers of Jesus Christ, inwardly strong, outwardly focused. First Presbyterian Church has maximized its current church to further enable his work to be continued on for generations to come.
The First Presbyterian Church of Tulsa was established in 1885 and was the first church in the area.
The church was an outgrowth of the mission school, a Presbyterian mission school that was established before that time, about 1883, for the purpose of educating Indians here in Tulsa.
The church originally met in the schoolhouse that was located on the corner of what is now 4th and Boston.
Some local people who came with the railroad were here. One was J.M. Hall, who later was known as the father of Tulsa at that time, also a Presbyterian. He and others gathered together to establish the first church.
The church grew as the city of Tulsa grew, and by 1900 they needed to move to a new building. 11 years later, the population had continued to develop enough to where they again needed to expand. So they built a new church at 7th and Boston, where they're still located today.
The architecture of the church that we're familiar with was established when the sanctuary building was built in 1925, and it is an English Gothic style of architecture with the idea of the pointed arches in the windows and in the shape of the ceiling and the rest of the location of the church.
The person credited for the design of the church is the wife of First Presbyterian's first pastor, Annie Kerr. Mrs. Kerr had received a degree in art and architecture and worked closely with the architects throughout the building and design of the sanctuary.
She wanted the design to have the cathedral look of the European cathedrals, but she wanted it done so be modern and functional. And in the process of building it, it was built with the idea of no columns or supports to obstruct the view of the front of the sanctuary and the pulpit and the activity there.
Another important feature is the many stained glass windows that serve a dual purpose in the church.
Also, it has to do with the light coming in. So you see these images through light. You see them because the light is coming through. So there are all these associations to with the divine. So it creates this ambiance, the light filtering in. It creates an atmosphere in a way for a more, otherworldly, ethereal experience.
At First Presbyterian Church of Tulsa, the main purpose of the stained glass is to educate. Many of the windows depict prayers or stories from the Bible.
This church, when Annie designed it, was designed to have one major feature, one major window in the front of the church, which is known as the I Am window. It's Christ knocking at the door, in other words, the door of your heart, in which is done to welcome you in and take him into your heart.
First Presbyterian's latest expansion began in 2011. The church needed to expand once again to accommodate its growing congregation. A second steeple was added to match the one that had been standing since the structure was built in the 1920s.
First Presbyterian Church has maximized its current church to further enable his work to be continued on for generations to come.
Holy Family was built as a response to a lot of Catholic parents who lived in the small Tulsa town. Back in 1899, they wanted a Catholic school for their children to learn. At the same time, there was a need to build a Catholic church. They built the church right next to the school at 3rd and Elgin in Tulsa. It was a small wood frame structure that served the parish well until about 1907. At that time, oil was discovered in Glenpool and brought a lot of Irish Catholics to the area. In 1912, Holy Family was excavated. Professionals came in, built the steel superstructure, and it's still holding strong today. The original 1899 church was rectangular, and that worked. It served just fine. In 1907, they expanded that church to give it a cross shape, much like a lot of the churches that you'd find in Europe. That cross-shaped church increased the capacity of that original church from about 125 to 350. That helped to ease the problem for a few more years, but it still wasn't adequate.
As the population of Tulsa grew, so did the Catholic community. The church had to move from 3rd and Elgin to 8th and Boston so they could have more room, and that is where the church currently resides.
The priest who built the church at 8th and Boulder really liked German churches. They're almost all Gothic. And he used a lot of French and German Gothic characteristics, such as the interior plaster. Everything is painted on the inside. However, the exterior is French Gothic or German Gothic in the sense that it's very monolithic or solid. It has a very castle-like feel. And at the top of the bricks, before the walls that were brick turn into the cones of copper that go all the way up to the sky, you can see what looks like castle turrets. Well, this was borrowed from English architecture. So the interior of Holy Family is very French Gothic or German Gothic. The exterior is a combination of French, German, and English Gothic.
You see imagery really used in Catholic churches. The icon was thought, it was an image, and the original ones are thought to have been portable, and they would be of saints, and be Christ and Mary and various saints, and they were thought to hold the actual presence of that person. So often they were used to inspire and instruct, to maybe ask for wisdom, to ask for direction.
Probably the one feature of Holy Family that gets more attention than anything else is our stained glass windows. They're based on a famous series of windows that were built in Munich, Germany. They're called the Meyer windows.
The Meyer windows are a series of 10 windows depicting the life of Christ. We see the birth of Christ in the nativity scene, the ministry of Jesus, his death on the cross and rising from the dead on Easter, his encounters with his apostles, and finally, the descent of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost.
So in 10 windows, we get 10 snapshots into the history of salvation, or the story of Jesus and the apostles. So these windows, the Meyer windows specifically, but all church windows, are meant to reinforce the faith of the people who pray there, or to be used as a teaching tool, an educational tool for those who walk into the church.
During a recent renovation, Holy Family received many upgrades and makeovers. The most significant and drastic change would be the addition of bold paint to the walls behind the three altars at the front of the church.
When the church was repainted, the focus, the goal, was to try to get as many colors from those beautiful stained glass windows reflected in the walls of the church. So what we did was we looked to the clothing that different people in the windows are wearing as inspiration for some of the major colors on the wall.
For example, the medium blue from Mary's cloak inspired the blue for the wall behind the Mary altar. The royal purple of Joseph's coat was taken for the walls around the Joseph altar. And the red and wine color of Jesus' robes in the window, where he turns water into wine, inspired the rich red behind the central altar. Throughout the years, the church has grown along with the congregation. Holy Family is an important landmark for local Catholics and an important landmark in downtown Tulsa. The traditional art and architecture are just as much a part of the church as the people who populate it.
The church was founded by J.W. Marshall. They moved here from Missouri, and the Disciples of Christ Church, Christian Disciples of Christ Church, had become very popular in the United States, and they were looking forward to one here, and there wasn't one. So they met for quite a while in his farmhouse, and then built their first church at 2nd and Boulder, and then we just grew from there. We've been at 2nd and Boulder, 4th and Boulder, and then this is our 3rd church, 9th and Boulder, and this is where we still are.
First Christian's current building was dedicated 10 years after the second building on February 1st, 1920. The building took on a Greek design, even though the restrictions caused by World War I made it difficult. On the outside, the design is a modification of a classical Greco-Roman architecture featuring a pillared entrance.
This church, when it was built, cost $250,000. They originally thought that it would cost between $75,000 and $85,000. I have no idea what it would cost to replace it. When the church was built originally, the plaster that they used horsehair to help hold it together. The sanctuary has been remodeled, was once in the 1960s. There may have been some little minor things done prior to that, but the major remodel was done in the 1966. I think the panels were put in 1966 when it was remodeled.
During the renovation, the pews were exchanged for theater seats, and while they did lose a few seats, the sanctuary still holds a little more than 800 people. For the dome ceiling, a clear skylight was installed over the stained glass to help withstand the Oklahoma wind and storms. The dome-shaped ceiling is home to many different shades of green, but to go along with the colors, the church also has matching green carpet and chairs. On top of the church is a stained glass dome that was modeled after the Byzantine style. The dome itself was designed by a group of architects and constructed by a firm in Minnesota. The dome sits 50 feet above the sanctuary floor and is 50 feet in diameter. The stained glass portion is 26 feet wide and 6 feet tall.
It's unusual. It's unusual, and yet not too far out. It's a Greek-Roman design. I don't know that there was, other than I'm sure things were just presented to the board at that time, and they went with what they liked. And I think they wanted it to be different, and yet not too different. The dome, at one point when it was first put in, a section of it you could wind, and a section of it would open. They would open the windows, and therefore they would have an airflow because there was no air conditioning. So they could open the dome. It was cleaned in 1991. Prior to that, I don't know when, and then it was cleaned. We cleaned it again last year. So 10 years, and it is quite a process. And I will say that the gentleman who did it fell in love with the dome.
The church receives many visitors and hosts about 3 or 4 tours a week. Being along historic Route 66 helps bring in some visitors.
I would like for anyone who's interested to come see it, because I think it is an architectural beauty, not just because it's the church, but as I say, the architecture of it is different, and it is very beautiful to see.
In the early 1900s, a small group of Tulsa residents formed a congregation that would become as old as Oklahoma. The First Church of Christ Scientists, presently located at 10th and Boulder, downtown.
The church started in the early 1900s. There were some Christian Scientists that had come to Tulsa, which was in Indian Territory, of course, and at that time, Christian Science was a very new religion, new denomination, up and coming. It was quite well known because its founder, Mary Baker Eddy, was a well-known woman of the day, known for her spiritual healing activities. And so it was 1904 or 1905 that they formed a society. And then they translated that into a church in 1907. 1908 was when they got the charter from the state. So the church itself has got about the same age as the state of Oklahoma. And the building was begun in 1918 and finished in 1923.
The construction of the church didn't come without a few challenges, though.
Well, the main challenge that's recorded in the history of the church really has to do with financing. As I said, they started the building in 1918. They voted to begin construction in spring of 1917, and 1917 also happens to be when the U.S. entered World War I. So there were some economic difficulties that came shortly after that. So after they had finished the first floor, this room that we're in now that serves as a Sunday school, that initially was the meeting place for the church, and so they, in summer of 1918, they had that finished, and they used that for the next several years. Then in 1921 it was that they began completing the building the auditorium upstairs and the dome.
The dome is a classic inspired space, typical of ancient Greek and Roman times.
Especially Christian Scientist building almost has the Pantheon-like structure, the classical front, you know, the very geometric, the dome on top. The dome is almost a logical cap for a cube, but you often have the engineering structural challenges of how do you make that transition from dome to cube. But they seem more classically inspired in that respect, less Gothic.
And then in 1935, the interior was completely redecorated under Ada Robinson's direction.
The outside of the building also reflects the same classic style.
I had not really appreciated until reading Dr. Robinson's descriptions of it, how the floor plan of the church is in the shape of a cross. Both sides of the cross are the same length, unlike the crosses we typically think of.
Over time, the church added on to the building to accommodate for families with children and for passers-by wanting to learn more about Christian Science. They decided to add a reading room.
Well, it was to provide a better space for the children. At the time, there were a number of members that had children, about to have children, and the space that we had was really not very accommodating to a children's room.
If you look across the street at Christ Scientist Church, look at all the complex forms that have been added to that, and that to me just keeps talking about how education and instruction have always been a part of the Christian church, because many of those areas are designed for, for teaching and for educational purposes.
At one point, and I'm not sure exactly the timeline on it, but there had been a frame house next door to the church where the parking lot is now, on one of those lots, and it was used for many years as an administration building and a reading room, and it was taken down, I think, in the early 1960s, and so that was probably one of the factors that weighed into. After that was gone, they found they needed some more space, and so they built on the addition, I think. The reading room is a place for the public. It's kind of a combination bookstore, lending library, sells periodicals of the Christian Science Publishing Society, like the Christian Science Monitor, the Sentinel and Journal, and provides a place for the community to learn more about Christian Science.
The very first church for this congregation was established in Tulsa in 1886. They sent a group from Kansas to establish, it was really a mission church. The Presbyterian church was already here, and they asked for help because of the wild cowboys and Indians, and they coming to town on the weekend. They felt they needed another church to create another mission. They moved from what we called the Little White Church, which was near an area where the Cain's Ballroom is, to 5th and Boulder, and it was the Red Brick Church. And they stayed there till they moved here in 1921. They had a march up Boulder from the 5th and Boulder Church to this one, and it actually stretched the entire length. The first members were coming in and going down the stairs as the last members were leaving, and they were led by a Dixieland band. This letter was actually written by John Wesley. He founded the Methodist Church many, many years ago. A member was on a trip to New York in an auction house, saw the John Wesley letter, and it was authenticated. The authentication is on the back. It was written in 1772. He's talking about a trip that he was going to make. And the little red mark in the center, it kind of looks like a tear, but it's actually his seal.
The sanctuary itself has only been remodeled once, but throughout the years, a few things have been added and remodeled.
The center cylinder used to be glass, but they went to the metal so that they could put speakers in them. The crowns and the chains are all original. The trumpets, they were added, probably 20 years ago. So they were not original. But the huge gray pipes you saw were the original pipes. But then as electronics took over, because right now the console can be programmed to play itself. The marble on the chancel area we talked about, where the pews or the pulpit and the choir chairs are, was deteriorating, and it was replaced with white marble. And the pulpit was pulled forward so that the people in the chapel, they have closed screen, but they could at least see the minister while he was preaching. Your windows are the most unique thing for us. Now, the Episcopal Church Trinity has some beautiful, very unique windows, but our windows would probably be the most unique thing. I know that Trinities each have a story. Now, ours are all designed except the returning Christ, and that's what he symbolizes. Not the risen Christ, but the returning Christ. And it's actually called the Great Revelation Window.
In the 1980s, during a hailstorm one afternoon, a wind caught the hail at just the right moment, sending the hail into the windows. The holes were small but expensive. After the damage had been repaired, a protective seal was put on to keep any future hail from damaging the windows.
They chose oak for the wood in the church because it was a sign of strength and solidarity, which became very important as the Depression moved forward. The limestone around the outside of the church came from an old limestone quarry out what would be northeast of town. It was in an area called the Dawson area. And that's where the limestone on the outside came from. The limestone inside the sanctuary came from Philadelphia. They wanted something to add a little color to the stone because it was very plain, and but yet looked symbolic. And they chose it, and it went up, and that's really about all they ever wrote about it. That is a Gothic Tudor design. What's one of the things that makes it that the windows, the doors, and the pews all come to a point, and there's 3 layers to them.
Adjoining First United Methodist, First Christian, and Christ Scientist is the City Park Cathedral Square.
Well, that was, the money for it was donated and built by members in memory of another family of members, but it's actually a city park. We maintain it, but it's called Cathedral Square, but it's under the City of Tulsa park system.
Boston Avenue was built in 1929. The building's unique Art Deco design sets it apart from other churches in Tulsa.
I think it is a very incredible building, and if you think about what it drew from, I mean, it's, you know, a 1920s, you know, conception, and you have the idea of Art Deco being utilized plus Gothic, and Art Deco wasn't exclusive of Gothic principles in terms of vertical lines. So you have these prototypes again to draw from, the language to draw from. You know, there are plenty of Gothic features to the building, even into the sculptures and the jamb structures that are within the doorways. You have that going on, but you also have, you know, 1 foot in the modern world, the idea of skyscrapers. You know, and skyscrapers are also connected to Gothic sculpture and structure. So you have that connection going on.
Designing this beautiful building was not an easy task. The building committee in 1925 struggled to find a design they liked.
They interviewed a number of architects. They even had some submittals, design submittals from a number of different architects, and they didn't like any of the designs. They thought they were all kind of things that had been done before, that they weren't original enough, and they wanted something that was, to them, truly a 20th century church, something that was very contemporary and modern for the time. And they didn't care for the things that had been submitted.
That is, until the wife of the chairman of the building committee suggested Ada Robinson.
She was approved to be the designer of the church by the building committee, and the next thing they needed, because she was not an architect, was to actually hire an architect that could take her ideas, her sketches, and translate it into documents that a project could be built from. And so upon her recommendation, they hired the firm of Rush, Endicott & Rush, a leading local architectural firm.
In the 1920s, it was rare to have a woman design a building.
So you have Rush, Endicott & Rush, the architects, and Ada Robinson, the artistic designer, and they had a few disagreements, and the major problem was the architectural firm really wanted to control the project, control the design, and Ada Robinson stood up to him and said, you know, this is what I design and this is what I want. And so there was this constant tension between the two.
Ada Robinson designed the building to be different and more artistically decorated than other Methodist churches at the time.
Methodist churches typically involve almost no symbolism and no art built into the buildings in terms of sculpture or mosaics or of that nature. This building not only is an outstanding example of vertical Art Deco architecture, but it incorporates sculpture, which was a totally new thing to the Methodist Church to actually put that in a building. So it's integral to the building. There's a lot of symbolism, repetition of form that goes on throughout the building. There's what we call the praying hand motif that's repeated in the finials and parapets all around the perimeter of the building, and then culminates in the top of the tower itself. So there are all these abstract symbols that are part and parcel to the building.
The building was designed and built, but not without obstacles.
And it was planned during the euphoric 20s when times were flush, Tulsa was booming, there was everybody was making money, and you know, there was a real optimism in the air. The building wound up really costing $1.5 million by the time the design was totally finished and it was built. The church had all of that was paid for except for $300,000. And in 1929, when the building was finished, the Wall Street crash hit in October of that year, and a lot of people lost everything, lost their money, and it really looked like the church was going to get foreclosed on because they had no way to pay off the $300,000 debt. And they went through a very crisis period. Today, $300,000 for a building this size that's a $30 million building is something that is, you know, we think, well, that's just a small amount. Why? But at the time, that was a huge, huge amount of money. And they finally were able to find an insurance company that would give them a mortgage for the last $300,000 so that they could pay the note off and own the building free and clear.
The auditorium can seat 1,800 people and is decorated with many stained glass windows. A huge mosaic behind the choir loft, wood carvings all around, and a magnificent stained glass ceiling. The chapel, mostly used for funerals and some weddings, also has beautiful stained glass windows, wood carvings, and decoration incorporated into the design. In the Great Hall, 2 large mosaics were added in 1993, one symbolizing the Old Testament and the other the New Testament.
We kind of laugh about this a little bit because we say every 30 years we do a significant addition to the building. And so the first, when the building was approximately 30 years old, we did our first addition, and that is we took our covered drive-through and enclosed it, and that's what we now call Bishop's Hall, which is what you walked through when you came into the building. Immediately east of that is what we call our education wing. That was built at the same time. Beyond that is what we call the Jubilee wing, and that was added in approximately 5 years ago, about 30 years later, and I was the architect on that.
Today, the building stands as a work of art and as a unique building that is set apart from other churches and is an integral part of Tulsa's skyline. The cathedrals of downtown Tulsa represent a history of faith and are a unique reflection of this community. The distinctive architectural styles are lasting monuments and treasures to be cherished.